Tonight, I'm glad you all are able to join us. We're going to talk about nutrition. Actually, our speaker is, and we'll introduce her in just a minute. Couple announcements. Thank you all for doing so good and being so diligent on your assignments last month. Appreciate that, definitely. And to talk back to the infographics from a couple months ago, we are working right now to get those out, and so that we can let you all know who the chosen winners were and how we're going to highlight you all. So you all should be getting an email very soon on that. And your assignments will be coming to you this evening once the webinar is done. And to give you a sense of those, just so you can be listening, one of them will be talking about how to use different byproducts in cattle rations. So you can be thinking about that a little bit as our speaker discusses that. And then the other one will be a more hands-on activity where you'll be designing your own human version of your calves' feed ration that they've been enjoying. So you can just think about those few things as we're discussing this evening. And as always, feel free to reach out if you have any questions. So now I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Jackie Adkins, and she's going to introduce our speaker for us.
All right. Well, good evening, everybody. Happy spring. It's starting to look like spring in Montana, which means it snows. But that's okay. We're just happy for spring. It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, a good friend of mine, Dr. Rachel Endecott. Dr. Endecott is a native Montanan. She grew up ranching and working hands-on with cattle her whole life, and currently is ranching still in Montana, which is a hard thing to do in Montana if you talk to any Montanans about this. Rachel has a PhD in nutrition, and she worked for 10-ish years as the Montana State Beef Cattle Extension Specialist. So not only is she highly trained in nutrition, but as an extension specialist, you get to answer all kinds of different topics and questions about beef cattle. And so Rachel is well versed in reproductive physiology, nutrition, genetics, rangeland, all different sectors of the beef industry. And so we're really fortunate to have had the chance to work so closely with Rachel. She has recently launched in her own business called Gray Horse Consulting. And again, we're very fortunate to continue to have a relationship with Dr. Endecott and have her with us tonight to visit with you all. So Dr. Rachel, welcome. I should also mention that Dr. Endecott is very closely related to the SPC. She has ran the SPC for at least maybe a year or two. I can't quite remember all the facts, but so she's very familiar with this program and with education along these lines. And so again, we're just real lucky to have Dr. Endecott continue to work with us in this group. So Dr. Rachel, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Dr. Jackie. Well, I see some names I recognize. So hello, Littman and Radalin families. Great to see you, and happy to be back giving a little SPC talk here this evening. So Chip and Bailey and Jackie asked if I'd be willing to talk a little bit about feedlot nutrition. So we're going to tackle that topic here this evening. So can we confirm that my slides are showing? Is that what, are we good there?
Yes, I can see them.
Fantastic. All right, let's see if I can advance them. All right, well, here's what we're going to do. Hopefully you can see this too. So tonight's topics are going to be we'll start with the 6 classes of nutrients. So we'll kind of start at basic nutrition level. Then we'll talk about the growing versus the finishing phase of the feedlot process. I'll speak a little bit about bunk management. And so that'll give us some comparison between maybe a more traditional pen-fed feedlot system and then your steers, which are in an individual grow-save system. And then we'll have a brief discussion at the end about feed additives and growth promotants as well. And so looking
Now,
forward. Yes,
sorry,
ma'am.
not to bother you and interrupt too much, but are you sharing your slide as the presentation view right now? Right now, we can just see it on file view.
Yes, I am
see you
sharing it on
progressing the
presentation
slide.
view. Okay, I am not
Oh,
sure.
I just saw you move something, so maybe it was just frozen there.
Okay, let's try one more time here. Why does it say? So where I've got, it says it's sharing that it's sharing that it's up, that it's paused. And I'm not sure what that means.
Jackie, can you see things on your side? Or Kathy?
What do you mean? Presenter part of it's paused. So let's try it again. Just 1 second. Okay.
You bet.
Looks like you probably a double clickers.
Now, SPC participants, you can see that even the professionals that do this many times a month, it's not always perfect. So bear with us for just a minute.
And since I've sort of retired from Simmental, I'm not as good as GoToWebinar as I once was. I'm now a Zoom person, so I'm not sure what I'm doing here. So, all right. So let's see. I'm gonna see.
I can see it now.
It did something there.
Okay. All
We
right.
see
So
the
now
classes of
hopefully we can now
nutrients.
see classes of nutrients. Does that seem appropriate with a picture? Fantastic.
Yep. Perfect.
All right. Let's see if we can't keep going here. All right, so the first and one we often forget about is the most important, and that is water. And so certainly we know for both humans and animals that class of nutrient is critical. So carbohydrates are the next one that we'll talk about. And so you'll notice that my graphic is fairly human food oriented, which actually fits in nicely with what Bailey was discussing about what one of your assignment options is. So carbohydrates would be, an energy source along with fats. And so we'll come back to those two categories and how they fit into the energy piece here in just a minute. The fourth category or class of nutrients is protein. And then we have vitamins and minerals to wrap it up here. So carbohydrates are going to be those things, particularly from an animal feed perspective, that are often starch based. So when we think about corn or barley, for example, those are going to be high in carbohydrates. So then fats also provide energy. And so we can lump those two different nutrient classes under a bigger heading of energy. Now, fats are unique on this list because they are more energy dense than carbohydrates. Now, protein can also provide some energy. Protein, however, that's a very inefficient way to get energy. So fats, in fact, are so energy dense that they have 2.25 times the amount of energy than a carbohydrate or a protein. So 2.25 times more energy in a fat than in a carb. And so some energy sources that would be fat-based that we might encounter in the animal feeding world would be, any kind of vegetable oils, certainly tallow, so actual beef tallow, beef fat or hog fat can also be an ingredient. Now, protein is going to be the building block of muscle, and so it's very critical, obviously, for growth and development of an animal, which is important in our feedlot setting as well. And so then we get down to the teensy-tiny little tiny details, and those are our vitamins and minerals. And so while they're not needed in large quantities, they're often very critical to a lot of the processes in the body that need that vitamin or mineral presence in order for those processes to run efficiently, effectively, and to make the best use of the rest of the nutrients on this list. So while we're classifying things, so we've classified our 6 classes of nutrients. So now we're going to go a little bit broader. We're starting at the fine point, and we're going to get a little bit, lose a little focus and go a little higher. So in animal feeding, we talk about these feed group classifications. Now, of course, I've got water down here on the end, but we'll focus maybe on these first 3 for a little bit. So we have roughages, concentrates, and high protein feeds. And so roughages are basically going to be any of those forage-based feeds. So any sort of hay, grass hay, alfalfa, corn silage, wheat straw, barley straw, corn stalks, any and all of those forages that are often going to contain the whole plant. On the other hand, concentrates then are going to be those energy sources. So they're concentrated sources of energy, hence concentrates. So those are often going to be the seeds for our forages that we had in our roughage section, particularly if we think about, say, corn or barley or wheat. Now, high protein feeds, on the other hand, are going to be those that are not going to be as high in energy as concentrates. So some examples here would be things like soybean meal or cottonseed meal from the plant-based side of the world. There are also high protein feeds that come from the animal side of the world and from animal processing. So a couple of examples of high protein feeds that are animal sources would be fish meal and feather meal. So we can take the feathers from poultry processing and grind those down. And they're a very high, rich protein source. And then we have fish meal is just what you'd think it would be ground fish. And so those are things that we don't often think about and are probably not going to be those kinds of high protein feeds we're going to see often. And so certainly from our perspective of what ingredients we might see for your steers, we're going to probably be in the realm of maybe some silages, maybe some straws, maybe some hays, corn, maybe some soybean meal. Certainly a protein supplement would have some of those types of high protein feed ingredients. Now, Bailey talked earlier about byproduct feeds, and so where do those fit in here? Well, it just kind of depends. So certainly things like wheat middlings would fit in the concentrates category. And if you consider that soybean meal is a byproduct of soybean oil production, then it could be considered a byproduct feed that would fit into the high protein section. Another one that's very common now, more than it has been ever in the past, would be something from, it's a byproduct of the ethanol industry, and so that would be distillers grains. And so we can see that fitting into the concentrates in a lot of the different locations that are near ethanol plants. That byproduct is used to replace corn in a lot of feedlot rations. So I think you'll find that feedlot diets across the country will vary, and they'll vary by what's available. And so as an industry, we do a great job in the beef cattle, when any of the ruminant industries, at being able to utilize a lot of different kinds of products to get to the same end goal. And so while we might not see very much, say, sorghum grain as an option in the Midwest, as we go farther into Texas, for example, we might see that as a major ingredient in feedlot diets. And we're still going to be able to get the cattle to the same end point. So I know that you've had some webinars about health, and so we'll kind of show, and you might have covered some of these things, but I think it's a good review even if you did. And what we're trying to do when we're bringing calves into a feedlot, we're gonna call those calves receiving cattle, because we're gonna receive them into the feedlot, and our goal is to get them on a feed quickly. And so we want our nutrition programs to support our health programs. We know that often in a more traditional setting, we're going to have a whole bunch of calves that are probably going to be weaned straight off their mamas and sent to a sale barn, and then they're going to be put together with a whole bunch of other calves who have that same background. Everybody's going to show up and get commingled with one another. We're going to have a lot of mixing, and so we're going to have a lot of different animals from different locations all together. So think about what it's like when everybody goes back to school in person in the fall, when in the before times before COVID, and everybody went back to school, and everybody came from where they had spent their summer, and they come back to school, and everybody gets sick. It's exactly the same way with our feedlot calves. So we have a higher chance of them getting sick. So that's a challenge on the health side. On the nutrition side, often these calves are coming into a new environment. They may have never seen a feed bunk or a water tank before in their lives, and they're in a new environment. They aren't sure what to do. And so we know that those calves, especially if they're heavily stressed, are not going to eat a lot, and they're not going to drink a lot when they first enter the feedlot. And so those two things, the low feed and water intake, are main challenges that we're going to try to overcome with our receiving cattle nutrition program. So some things to think about from that standpoint would be that we'd want a high quality, preferably grass hay to start with, and something that's long stem, that's not chopped too finely, is probably best. And so 3 things that we're going to want to do in that ration after we kind of start to think about what other kinds of feeds might we add to that hay is we want to make sure that we're going to minimize dust. We know that if we have more dust, we have more chances of making any sort of respiratory disease worse. So say we're worried about some kind of pneumonia type things. So if we can decrease the amount of dust in the ration, we can maybe avoid some of that issues, because we know respiratory disease is going to be a major health challenge. We're going to want to minimize fermented feeds. And so fermented feeds, what I mean by that, best example of that would be corn silage. Okay, so we're going to take and harvest the whole corn plant. We're going to pack it into some kind of a bunker of some kind, or we might put it in a bag, and we're going to try to remove as much air as possible. And then we're going to let microbes work on that and ferment that feed. So kind of like turning cabbage into sauerkraut. Okay, that's what we're thinking about when we're thinking about fermented feeds. Now, that fermentation process, if you've been around corn silage at all, you know it has a very unique odor and probably taste to the animals. And so often it's very foreign for new calves into the feedlot. And so if we want them to eat lots, because we know that they're not going to want to eat a lot maybe, we're going to want to maybe avoid those feeds that are so foreign to them that they're not going to want to eat them. So we want intake to be high. Then lastly, we're going to avoid excessive starch. So we're not going to start them out with a whole bunch of corn or a whole bunch of barley or a whole bunch of sorghum because we don't want to have acidosis happen. And so acidosis is a big word. And it's a big problem, and there's a lot of different pieces to it. But for tonight, we'll think of that as digestive upset. So we're trying to make sure that the rumen, so the largest compartment of the 4 compartments of a rumen, of a cow's stomach, we're going to try and make sure that that environment doesn't get disrupted, because when it does, the calf will go off feed, they don't feel well, and we can do damage to the inside of that rumen and make it so that they aren't able to adequately absorb nutrients as well as they could be if they hadn't had that digestive upset. So hopefully I'm convincing you throughout these slides that water is pretty important. So fresh, clean water is essential. And thinking about, depending on the area where the calves came from, like I said earlier, are the calves used to drinking from a tank? Have they seen water like that before? It's good often if the calves can hear the water splashing. If you have the ability to build your bunks in such a way that if the calves are walking along the outside, pacing around the fence of the pen, if they can walk into a water tank so it's in their way, that's a great way to introduce them to it. If the cattle have never seen a tank, if they're used to only live water, so if they've only drank out of a creek or river their whole life, overflowing a tank for a short period of time so that they know that there's water in it might be a good idea as well. So we talked about making sure that the nutrition program complements and takes into account the health issues of this kind of a group of cattle. And so we talked about those teensy-tiny important nutrients that are vitamins and minerals earlier. And we talked about how those vitamins and minerals are important in different processes in the body. And one of those really important processes is the immune system. And so vitamins A and E, as well as the minerals copper, zinc, selenium, and manganese, are all very important components of our immune system. Ours, cattle, all mammals. And so in order to make sure that we're doing a good job, we might really fortify and beef up these receiving diets in vitamins and minerals so that those calves get a good start when they get to the feedlot and are able to support their immune system, because we know that their health will be challenged. In addition, stress has a negative effect on the immune system. And so you might know this too. This kind of goes back to the school idea as well. Certainly, if you're running too hard and you have too many, you have soccer practice and then you're playing your clarinet and you have tests to study for and you're just run down, you might be more likely to get sick than if you're getting lots of sleep and you're taking good care of yourself and you're eating well. We know that disease agents, like we talked about, like you probably learned about in your feedlot health webinar, are often going to be the ones that challenge the animal during this time. This is the most stressful period of a calf's life to date, and we know that their feed intake will be low. So we're going to try to balance these first diets to be as nutrient dense as possible, because we know they won't eat as much as we might wish. So we want to make sure that every bite of feed in a receiving calf's diet is going to be nutrient dense. And so, like we said earlier, energy, protein, vitamins, and minerals are critical here. And I'll underline again the importance of these 4 trace minerals: copper, manganese, selenium, and zinc. Very important in immune system function. Now, this might not, the receiving portion, part of that really played a role in your calves, but the majority of your calves were probably weaned off their dams for a while, so we weren't sending bawling calves to Missouri. And so that receiving phase is still important because we're still going to adapt calves to a new environment. But certainly we'll be able to move faster into our general 2-phase feeding program that would be growth or growing and finishing. And so during the growing phase, what we're trying to do is promote frame and muscle growth. And so relative to the finishing phase, that diet is probably going to have a higher roughage to concentrate ratio. Okay, there still might be the majority of the diet still might be a concentrate, but there'll probably be more roughage at the beginning during this growing phase than in the finishing phase when we're trying to promote fat deposition. So we're trying to get those animals finished We want them to look really smooth. We want them to be laying down marbling inside the muscle. And so in order to get to that point, then we're going to start to lower the amount of roughage that we feed every day and increase the amount of concentrate that we feed every day. And so here's kind of how we think about that. The title here is the normal postnatal growth curves of bone, muscle, and fat. And so postnatal just means after birth. Okay, so we've got our growth units on the up and down y-axis and time on the horizontal x-axis. So you can see we've got two arrows that point downward. The first is birth over here on the left, and the other is maturity up here on the upper right. And so we have these three different types of tissue. We've got bone, which is in black. And so we can see that we have an increase in bone growth early in the animal's life, but then that really kind of is flat throughout much of the growing period to maturity. Then muscle takes off next. That's the kind of orangish color here. And so we have a vast and quick increase in muscle growth. Then we kind of see it taper off and slow down a little bit to be a little more flat as we get towards maturity. And then fat is here in this gray line. And so we see that it's a slower rate than muscle until we get closer to maturity, and then we see it kind of take off. And so this kind of relationship between muscle growth and fat growth is what we're trying to accomplish in the feedlot. So in the early part of this curve, between birth and the middle, say, we're trying to get those animals to grow, and we're going to focus on muscle. And then after we've kind of we're getting that muscle in a place where we're happy with, then we'll kind of turn them loose, and we'll be more towards trying to put down fat. Now, it depends, but kind of traditionally, we've often thought about that a finish weight of an animal would be somewhere near the mature weight of a female in that same kind of genetic group. And so say if we're trying to get calves to finish at 1,450 pounds, then we might expect the set of cows that we have that those steers came out of to weigh something similar than that. With the high growth genetics that we have today, I'm not sure that we've accomplished that, but that's certainly been the common theme in our industry. So part of the challenge of feedlot nutrition is getting those calves from that stressed, really fragile almost, if you will, receiving calf, and stepping them up on feed to get them to be fat cattle and be ready to harvest. And so what we're trying to do during the step-up process is to increase the concentrate level in the diet really gradually, and we're trying to avoid that digestive upset that we talked about earlier. Now, depending on the cattle and depending on the feed yard, what exactly that timing is or how long it takes to step cattle up onto full feed will differ. You know, probably most commonly somewhere in the 10 days to 3 weeks is probably not uncommon throughout the country. One thing to keep in mind is that if cattle have gone out on grass as stockers, between weaning and they come back into the feed yard and they're yearlings already, they have some maturity under them. In general, those more mature cattle can step up faster than a calf fed who has entered the feedlot directly after weaning. So overall then, again, this is going to be feed yard dependent, but most finishing rations are going to end up somewhere in the 80 to 85% concentrate feed. Certainly that could creep up towards 90 in some cases as well, I suppose. And the concentrate feed doesn't always have to be just one ingredient. It could be a mix of corn and distillers, for example. But certainly we know that in that other 15 to 20% of the diet, some roughage will be necessary in order to maintain proper rumen function. And then we know that those concentrate feeds are not high in protein. And so we're going to have some sort of a protein supplement. Could be a variety of ingredients there. But we'll often have a vitamin and mineral premix included in that protein supplement, plus any other feed additives that we might run into. We'll talk a little bit more about those as well here a little later in that remaining 15 to 20% to get our diet to a full 100%. So bunk management is really important in the feedlot industry. And so it's been described as the most important daily task in finishing cattle. It's something that matters every day. There are people in commercial feed yards who read bunks. That is their job. They go out and read the bunk the first thing in the morning before each feeding. So again, lots of this is going to be feed yard dependent, whether or not they feed more than once a day, for example. But before the animals are fed, you're going to have somebody go read the bunk and see how that pen did. And so the goal here is that we want to keep those pens eating a consistent amount of feed. And at first, when I made this slide, I had keep animals eating a consistent amount of feed. And I think that that is true, but certainly in those environments that aren't like where your steers are in a grow safe, where you have the ability to track individual intake, we are feeding the pen. And we're assuming that each animal in the pen is doing an equal job of getting that feed in their body every day. If you've had any opportunity to look at any of the data from your grow safe calves, you'll see that when they have, when we are able to measure it, it's going to be pretty variable. The calves aren't necessarily going to eat 18 pounds every day, for example. They might eat 10 pounds today and 22 pounds tomorrow and come back down and eat 17 pounds the third day. But overall, as an average, we're going to try and keep some sort of consistent amount of feed. This allows then the feed yard to maximize animal performance, to minimize digestive upset, and really a really critical piece here is routine. And this would qualify as advice for you if you feed steers for 4-H or FFA or take steers to the Regional and National Classic. In order to keep calves going forward in a feed yard or feedlot finishing situation, routine is super important. You're going to want to feed those calves at a consistent time with a consistent amount and to have a consistent composition or make a recipe of ingredients. So if you decide that you need to change the amount that the cattle are ready to eat more because they've grown, or if you need to change the composition because of what feeds might have become available at a lower cost, you need to think about how to make those changes be gradual. Anything that we do really abruptly, like say, we've been feeding corn, but we can't get any this week, so we're just going to feed barley. So doing that without any sort of adaptation would be a giant wreck. And so we would not maximize animal performance. We would definitely not minimize digestive upset. And so feeding animals at the same time, same amount, and a similar ingredient composition is very critical. And so hopefully I've alluded a few times here to that it's a little different in SPC because the calves are in a grow safe system and we actually know more about what their individual intake is. And so the folks, Kenneth is going to be managing the bunk, the grow safe unit, a little bit different than a big commercial feed yard would manage in a more pen fed situation, because we want to make sure that there's enough feed in the grow safe bunk that they don't run out during the day, so that we can actually do the best job ever of capturing how much they're going to eat. So it doesn't do a whole lot of good to capture individual intake if they run out of feed, because that's not a true picture of what they're actually eating. So while the bunk management in a larger setting or in a completely pen-fed setting might look a little bit different. The idea is still the same, and bunk management is still something that we do. It just might have a different end goal depending on your location and what kind of options you have for individual feeding systems. So obviously feed costs are going to be the major expense of any sort of feedlot operation. And so you'll see that in your bills. And so one way that we can kind of measure some efficiency here is to take a look at how much feed, what is the total cost of the feed compared to each pound of gain that our animal makes in the feedlot phase. And so the two major factors that affect this measure, not surprisingly, are average daily gain and feed efficiency. So how many pounds per day is the animal gaining? And then feed efficiency, how many pounds of feed does it take that particular animal to gain 1 pound? And so if we look further into the feed efficiency piece, there's the top three variables that impact that are the energy density of the feed, the amount of dry matter consumed, again, how much are they eating, and then the rate of gain, how fast are they gaining. Okay, so if a feed has more energy in it, it's probably going to take less to get the same amount of gain than a feed that has less. So if you want to gain weight, eating a pound of chocolate is going to have a different impact on gaining weight than eating a pound of lettuce. Okay, so that's kind of the same idea here. So how can we improve feed efficiency in the feedlot phase? What are ways that feedlots might think about trying to do so to get the cattle to use the feed most efficiently and most cost effectively? Well, we're going to want to increase the energy density of the diet by feeding less roughage. Okay, we're going to probably want to process the grain. So we could feed whole corn, but the animals won't be able to use as much of the starch inside the kernel as they do if we say steam flake that corn. Same idea with barley. Whole barley has a pretty tough hull, and so wanting to put that barley through a roller mill or crack it is going to increase the availability of starch and energy to the animal. We may also wish to add feed additives or use growth promotants to improve feed efficiency. And so I'm going to talk in just a sec here about a couple of different feed additives. We'll talk a little bit about the basics of ionophores and the basics of beta agonists. And then we'll also talk more about growth promotants from an implant standpoint. If we're going to be efficient, one other way is to feed the cattle to the proper composition of gain. So one thing we do know as an animal nears finish is that they become less efficient. So the longer we keep an animal in the feedlot past the point of finish, we're just putting on some more fat, the less efficient they are at using that feed. It's going to take more pounds of feed to put on additional pounds of gain once they're at the finishing point. Minimizing climatic stress, right? So think about the feedlots in the middle part of the country when we had the big storm come through that went way farther south than they should. And so we certainly, those feedlots are going to have really seen the impact of that climate stress, that weather on those cattle, and they're going to be using more feed to try to stay warm in those situations than they will be using feed to put on weight. From a broader perspective, certainly, a feedlot can purchase genetically superior cattle. We know that some cattle are better than others at gaining. I think that from a efficiency and desirability standpoint, the Simmental breed is in a very good place and continues to be so as an option to improve the genetic superiority of feeder calves. And then the last thing is to just realize that the gender of cattle impacts feed conversion. So heifers, intact heifers are not going to be as efficient as steers, and certainly intact heifers will probably need some extra management. We won't talk about MGA feeding today, but those animals are going to be generally fed a feed additive that keeps them from showing estrus and cycling, because that will negatively impact their gain if they're riding each other during the feeding period. So as promised, I said we'd talk a little bit about some feed additives, and so we'll talk briefly about ionophores. Okay, so Rumensin and Bovatec are two ionophores approved by the FDA. Rumensin is the most common, one that you probably hear about a lot. And so really where these came from was they were looking for some antibiotics that would help in poultry with coccidiosis. And somehow the discovery was made that these antibiotics, Rumensin and Bovatec, alter rumen metabolism and improve animal performance. So a ruminant is a very unique creature, and so the rumen is full of microorganisms that are going to help the animal to digest the feed and make it so that the animal can absorb the nutrients. Ionophores shift what the proportion of nutrients look like in fatty acids in the rumen, and allow for increased feed efficiency, increased gain. So very common, certainly, though they are an antibiotic, they are used solely in animal production. No one is feeding ionophores. Ionophores are not a feed additive in human food, and are not an antibiotic used in human medicine, and so certainly are a very safe product for our industry to continue to have available to us, we hope. So then there's another type of feed additive that's called a beta agonist. Okay, now the ionophore works in the rumen. The beta agonist works outside of the rumen. Now, it's not a hormone. Okay, so it's different. We would probably classify it in both categories as a feed additive and a growth promotant, but it is not an implant. Okay, so it's something that the animal consumes. They are not just for cattle. There are beta agonists work in other species as well. So the two main ones in our industry are Zilmax and Optiflex. Ractopamine, so certainly the ractopamine is also in the hog industry as well. And so those are made by Merck and Elanco. And how they work, okay, so ionophores worked in the rumen and changed the proportion of nutrients inside the rumen. Beta agonists work on fat cells and muscle cells. And so they're going to make fat cells slow down their metabolism, and they are going to redirect and make muscle cells increase the size of the muscle fiber. So that the end result here is that the carcass contains a higher percentage of lean muscle. Okay, so what we're looking for here is we're trying to increase the amount of carcass weight that is muscle versus fat. And so the more weight then, in this case, the animals are kind of increasing some efficiency in such a way that more weight is produced by the same level of intake, when this feed additive is fed. Oops. And so these two are fed near the end of the feeding period. They aren't fed through the entire thing. So ionophores, on the other hand, are generally going to be fed throughout the feeding period. However, beta agonists will probably be fed somewhere between, based on the label, 28 to 40 days at the end of the feeding period. They do have a withdrawal period, much like any other antibiotic or other additive, but it's very short, say like 3 days. So it's easy then to pull that back out of the ration right before the animals head to the packing plant. So I'm going to digress and tell you a funny story. When I was teaching at Montana State, I taught about beta agonists in my beef cattle management class. And I asked my students on an exam if they could tell me what the mechanism of beta agonists were. And one of my students couldn't remember. And so he thought that he decided to be creative. And so he told me in his answer that it sounded like we were trying to antagonize beta fish. And he thought that we didn't want to do that because we might go to jail for fish crimes. And so I have a really hard time presenting about beta agonists without thinking about fish crimes. And so now you guys will all think about fish crimes every time you think about this too. All right,
Good.
Now back to topic. All right, we'll talk just quick about implants. Okay, these are growth promotants that are not in the feed. Okay, so they're going to work differently than either ionophores or feed additives. And so these are going to be small, slow release pellets that contain a growth stimulant. Okay, they're going to work by increasing concentrations of hormones involved in growth, and those are generally steroid hormones. And that leads to an increased amount of muscle deposition. Again, we're trying to get the carcass to have more muscle and less fat at the same amount of feed. Now, most implants then are going to be specifically designed for specific genders, specific ages of cattle, and or some combination of all three of these, the stage of production. So you're going to have different options for putting an implant in a calf when it's a calf, like say at branding, if you live in a brand state, compared to putting an implant into a calf that's entering the feedlot or even midway through the feeding period. So just for any of these items that we've talked about, from ionophores to implants, reading labels and following directions is going to be critical. Certainly, if you spend any time visiting with folks involved in beef cattle production, somebody's going to have a story about a wreck where they implanted the wrong animal with the wrong type of implant. And particularly if you use the wrong thing in a heifer calf, she won't be very fertile. So that was something that was learned early days during implanting that we've gotten much better at as an industry. So there's 3 naturally occurring hormones that are ingredients in implants, and those are estradiol or estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone. And then there's 2 synthetic hormones, and they're called zeranol, and zeranol acts just like estradiol or estrogen, and trenbolone acetate, or TBA. So you'll see lots of implants that are TBA, that stands for trenbolone acetate, and that mimics testosterone. So these are going to be more related to how we're going to use, we're going to alter muscle metabolism using these steroid hormones rather than those feed additives. So in our brief time together here this evening, we've got a quick and dirty overview of our 6 classes of nutrients. We talked a little bit about growing versus finishing and what those differences appear to be, what bunk management looks like, not only for a commercial feed yard perhaps, but for what your steers, the system your steers are being fed in. And then we finished up here with a brief discussion about feed additives and growth promotants, including fish crimes. So bet you didn't think we were going to talk about fish crimes. With that, that's kind of the end of what I've got for you formally. I would be happy to take any questions. If you want to unmute, we can open mic it and visit a little bit more. Happy to do it. And so thanks again for the opportunity to visit with you. I hope you've been enjoying your SPC process this year.
Well, Dr. Rachel, thank you very much. We certainly appreciate that. So, yes, like she said, if any of you all have any
Hey Bailey, can you try unmuting? That's kind of weird. Jackie, can you unmute and talk? I can hear myself. Or Rachel?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can. I can hear you. I just couldn't pretend.
Okay.
So all the attendees are, oh, now they're muted again. Okay, you get them all unmuted. You want? I see somebody actually typed a question, I think.
Oh, okay. Rachel, can you hear me? You might have to unmute yourself. Or Bailey, can you hear me?
I think Bailey can probably hear us because I can hear you, Jackie. If you want, you call Bailey, can you dial the phone number and call in on your, just call in on the phone? I know you're using the app, but maybe you could just dial in. It might come back.
Oh, Bailey says that she's muted. She can hear us, but she can't.
She can't. Well, she's on her phone, so I think she has to unmute herself.
It says you are currently muted by an organizer.
Yeah, but we can't. I don't think we can unmute her phone. Yeah, attendee can't be unmuted. She can't be unmuted till she puts in her PIN number. That's why I'm suggesting, Bailey, if you can hear me, to hang up your phone and just dial back in. And that'll get you going again. But we can probably carry on, right? Can Rachel?
Well, I'm not sure I've heard Rachel. I'm wondering if the same thing happened to Rachel.
It looks like Rachel looks like you should be able to mute. Why don't you try that right now?
Hey, there we go. I couldn't before, but now I am.
Yeah, something kind of funny happened.
Yeah.
There you go. So I don't know if the
well,
if any of the attendees.
Yep, looks like all of them can be unmuted if they choose to. I'm just checking them over here.
Didn't lose ya.
Nope, they're there.
I'm ready to hear it.
There is somebody.
Yeah, so if
I can't.
Anybody who's listening wants to ask a question, you can just click the unmute button, the little microphone button, and you ought to be able to have a live microphone and be able to ask Rachel a question. We can also try and, if you have a question you want to type in or chat in, you can do that as well. Rachel, I had a question for you while folks might be
Jackie.
figuring theirs out. So we talked a lot about the kind of the diet and the change of diet that you would expect to see in a feedlot animal.
Yep.
And that certainly is the focus of this group. I was wondering, although, many folks on this webinar tonight are probably also connected to the feedstock industry, and wondering if you might have some thoughts on how this changes for developing heifers or developing bulls, how a traditional feedlot diet might compare to somebody developing feedstock animals.
Yeah, great question. So I think probably from a heifer or bull development approach, those diets are probably also going to stay, I guess I'd call them staying in the growing phase rather than switching over to the finishing phase. So roughages are going to be a larger component of the diet. I think certainly it's a balancing act because you want to make sure, particularly if you're marketing, say, yearling bulls, you want to get those bulls grown up so that they can go out and do their job for your customers. But at the same time, you don't want to push them too hard so that they kind of fall apart. So think about, particularly as you get farther over in this country, there's going to be a lot of big, wide open country those cattle are going to have to work in. Those bulls are going to have to work in. So if they're used to kind of being pampered and they have to go out on some kind of short grass or some fescue maybe in some other parts of the country, and they're not very well prepared or adaptable to that, you might not get the breeding performance out of the bull that you had hoped for. So I think it's a bit of a challenge, certainly, to try to balance all the competing interests, I guess we'll call them, with bull and heifer development. Certainly we know on the heifer side, if we push too hard and they get too fat, that can both negatively impact milk production as well as reproductive success. And then if they have too much fat laid down in that pelvic canal, that first calf can certainly have some calving difficulty and some dystocia. We also know that, depending on the amount of fat that, say, a bull might be able to put down, can negatively impact testicular cooling. So it could have some impacts on semen quality as well. And so it is kind of a bit of an art and a science together. But my main difference, I think, would be we'd probably have more forage than concentrate compared to the finishing phase. And we want to try to kind of walk that fine line between letting the cattle express their genetic ability to grow and not pushing so hard that you end up negatively impacting their performance further down the line.
Excellent. Thanks, Dr. Endecott. Any questions from anybody else in the crew? Bailey, I think you have audio back.
Yes, I can hear you. So I am back live. I apologize. I'm not really sure what the issue was there. So yeah, any participants, this is definitely your chance if you want to pick your brain about any of the topics for your assignment coming up or any specific questions you have on your own. This is your chance. You've got someone pretty good on the line. No one? No takers?
Guess not. Well, that's okay.
No.
You guys know, those of you who were in SPC when I was working at ASA, you guys know I'm easy to find, and so I'm not that much harder to find now. So you can sure ask Bailey any question that might come up later, and she can send it my direction, and we can get it answered for you. So I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for sticking with us through our technology snafu. But we hopefully are back again. Jackie and I are just laughing because we do this with each other. It doesn't matter. We're always screwing it up. So no worries. Well, I hope everybody has a good evening. Thanks
good.
again for having me.
Yes, we certainly appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule and taking time out of an evening to spend some time with us. And participants, I hope you enjoyed and learned some stuff. And like I said, you should be getting your assignment sent via email this evening to you fairly soon. So keep out an eye for those, and those will be due on the 16th. So please make note of that and get those in on time. And that'll be right around when your billing's coming out as well. So you should be seeing a couple emails from me next week. So with that, unless anyone else has anything to add, then we'll go ahead and close it out.
All right. Have a great night. You guys take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Good night, everybody.